Hello, I'm Pete aka on a Retro Tip, and welcome to a rather unexpected episode in the cancelled games series. I really enjoyed the previous one on unreleased arcade games, and I honestly wasn't sure if I'd be doing another, but this video went from 10 to 15 to a now whopping 20 more cancelled arcade games. Thanks to everyone who made suggestions in the comments of the last episode, as that really helped me out. So without further ado, let's take a look at 20 more of the many cancelled arcade games. A sequel to Atari's widely ported 1984 arcade game Marble Madness was planned for a '91 release called Marble Man Marble Madness 2. The eagle-eyed among you may have seen this in the intro to the previous video. If you haven't played the original, it's one of those games that's beauty lies in its simplicity. You guide a marble around a three-dimensional isometric obstacle course and have to reach the goal within a set time limit. I played it on home consoles originally, but the arcade cab added another layer of skill as movement is controlled by a trackball. This sequel was to be beefier than the relatively short 6-level original, containing 17 levels plus pinball-like bonus stages, and was designed to capitalise on the attributes that made Marble Madness a hit on home consoles: its easy to learn, hard to master gameplay, catchy music and addictiveness. It was also tweaked to appeal to a younger audience, hence the introduction of a character, the titular Marble Man, who resembles a superhero with a marble for a head. This was 1991 after all, when mascots like Mario and Sonic were the in thing. This superhero theme also pops up in the gameplay, with several power-ups being available that give your marble powers, such as invisibility or the ability to fly. Atari created some prototype cabs for testing which allowed for up to 3 players to play at once, but they tested very poorly. Atari mistakenly put this underwhelming reception down to the trackball controls, so they then developed a second generation of cabinets with joystick controls, but these didn't perform any better. Several cabinets were obviously developed, and it's thought that at least 3 still exist in the hands of private collectors. Marble Madness 2 was entirely completed before it was canned, and Atari even went as far as producing promotional material, but perhaps they thought that the changing arcade scene of the early 90s, where fighters like Street Fighter 2 were emerging and dominating, was too competitive for this style of game. I didn't include this one in the first episode as it's already appeared in the cancelled games series, but here by popular demand is Primal Rage 2. The original Primal Rage in '94 had been quite the success in arcades, so the following year Atari had already begun working on a follow-up. Primal Rage 2 was expected to hit arcades in late '96, with home conversion shortly afterwards. The roster would include the 7 gods from the first game, plus an additional 10 characters, 1 more dinosaur, a new boss, and 8 human characters called the Avatars. A playable cabinet was built for testing in California. The control scheme was upgraded from the 4-button layout of the original to the more common fighter setup of 6 buttons. Presently there are 2 boards thought to exist. A ROM of the game had been dumped for a while but wouldn't run on emulators until someone created a modified version of MAME in 2017 called MAME for Rage 2, so you can play it on that if you're curious. It's unfinished with some bugs and unfinished elements here and there, but playable. Galloping Ghost Arcade in Chicago, who will pop up again later in this list, also have a playable cabinet on site, so visit them for the full experience if you're ever in the area. This one's making the list despite having only awful quality footage for 2 reasons. It looks awesome and it was developed by Treasure. Gunbeat was a racing game of sorts and was designed for Sega's Naomi arcade hardware with a planned 1999 release. Treasure conceived the idea when the Naomi was announced, and it would have been their second arcade game after 1998's Radiant Silvergun. Gunbeat, their first fully 3D game, was partly inspired by wacky races and saw up to 4 players racing atop vehicles or creatures around a track filled with hazards and enemies. The multiplayer feature would be achieved through the linking of cabinets. There were 4 selectable characters: Carmine, who races on a hoverbike, Mirabelle on a broomstick, Kunianya riding a giant flying squirrel, and Squadman, who is himself a vehicle as he's a giant robot that can run and fly. It sounds insane and insanely fun. The racing element is built upon with the addition of action and shooting elements, so your character can fire projectiles which can slow down the opponents and also destroy the course's hazards and enemies. Each of the 4 characters would have their own special shot type. As with many of Treasure's games, scoring played a major part, with some huge boss-like enemies awarding bonus points if defeated, and the player can chain combos together to boost their score. The available footage doesn't give much away due to it being filmed on a potato, and there are very few screenshots as well. It seems that the game was tested, featured in magazines, and was shown in a video-only form by Sega at a Japanese expo AOU in 1999, who were showcasing games for their new Naomi hardware. Interestingly, the other 3 games shown, Crazy Taxi, F.R.E.A.K. Challenge and Zombie Revenge, were all ported to Dreamcast. Seeing as the Dreamcast hardware was almost identical to that of the Naomi, making arcade ports far easier, I'd put money on Gunbeat getting a Dreamcast release had it made it to arcade. Gunbeat got a warm reception at the show, receiving praise for its speed, looks and signature Treasure quirkiness. It's thought that it was cancelled when the project lead left the company, who Treasure were unwilling to replace due to their displeasure with the game's progress, so development was halted in May of 2000. SegaSonic Brothers, which to clarify is stylized as BORS with a full stop like Super Mario Brothers, which in English is pronounced brothers, not bros, was a falling block puzzle game akin to Columns or Puyo Puyo. The blocks are actually comprised of different coloured Sonics, classic blue, supersonic yellow, red, and in later levels white, and fall in groups of 4. In contrast to the typical setup in these games where you're creating lines or groups of matching colours, in SegaSonic Brothers the aim is to surround a group of blocks with blocks of a single colour. In other words, you need to create a single coloured loop around some blocks, or surround blocks if against one of the walls. Once achieved, this will destroy both the blocks making up the loop and those inside it. Dr. Robotnik sits in the centre of the screen during gameplay and receives electric shocks when blocks are cleared, with their intensity increasing the more blocks are cleared at one time. Once a set number have been cleared, a Chaos Emerald will appear which destroys all blocks in a line and any above it, so the strategy there is to simply place it as far down as possible. There are flashing arrows in the centre that indicate roughly how near each player is to getting a Chaos Emerald. After level 30, the difficulty is increased by the addition of the 4th block type, a White Sonic. 2-player mode is exactly the same but against an opponent, just like in Tetris or Puyo Puyo, and the game's won by scoring 300,000 points or when your rival's blocks reach the top of the screen. At face value, the game is like any other falling block arcade puzzler, but upon closer inspection it's actually quite a bit trickier, in part due to the fact that we're also used to matching colours in these games, so it's a bit counterintuitive. SegaSonic Brothers was designed by Fukio Mitsuji, who created Bubble Bobble and interestingly created the underappreciated puzzle game Popples on the Game Gear. Despite being intended for release in '92, it wasn't discovered until very recently. It was developed for Sega's System 32 arcade hardware, but poor location testing in Japan led Sega to cancel it. Perhaps its counterintuitive gameplay played a factor in this, but that's pure speculation on my part. There are 2 cancelled sequels to Atari's 1989 driving simulation Hard Driving. One was Street Driving, planned for 1993, but we'll be looking at Hard Driving's Airborne. These graphics, believe it or not, were shit hot at the time, and the original Hard Driving was even marketed as the world's first authentic driving simulation game. It was ported to numerous home computers and also the Mega Drive and Lynx. I played it a lot on the Amiga, and it inspired several games such as 4D Sports Driving or Stunts if you're in North America. Also planned for '93, Hard Driving's Airborne was another polygonal driving sim, but this time with a twist. In this one, your car can transform into a glider. The fun of the original was in its physics, the joy of shooting over a ramp at top speed and seeing how far your car would go. This feeling in Airborne is exaggerated further as you can simply glide after taking off. The gliding is necessary to make certain jumps and can even open up shortcuts, making the gameplay somewhat more complex. Still, it's an odd concept and one that was perhaps a bit unnecessary. I only found out about 10th Degree after my last episode, but this has really interested me. In development from Atari, 10th Degree's aim was to blend the gameplay styles of Tekken and Street Fighter. Being developed by Atari Games, 10th Degree was originally called Juco Threat. James Goddard took creative lead. He'd worked on Super Street Fighter 2 prior to this. He actually created the character DJ and went on to work as a designer on 2013's Killer Instinct reboot. At first glance I wasn't a fan of the game's graphical style, but I warmed to it. It's like a cross between the 3D Capcom fighters like Street Fighter EX or Rival Schools and Dead or Alive. I actually quite like it. Of course, this prototype is unfinished, as is evident from the gaps in the legs of some of the characters. The moves seem to be very similar to those in Capcom's fighters, with Hadouken-like projectiles and super moves, but also has the more intricate grapples and holds of the Tekken series. Its characters are reminiscent of Street Fighter at times, with one female fighter being dressed very similarly to Cammy, and there's a gi wearing fighter called Kyo who looks suspiciously like Ryu. But to be fair, it has its share of original looking fighters too. The thing that intrigued me the most about 10th Degree was its speed. This has a superb sense of pace, which is my #1 criterion when judging a versus fighter. Sure, it's perhaps more floaty than traditional Capcom fighters like Street Fighter 2, more like the EX series, but I love those games. Gameplay is fast and furious, just as it should be. I'm not sure when 10th Degree was planning to hit the arcades, but it was being developed at some point in the mid-90s. Atari Games cited the quote, poor state of the fighting market as their reason for cancelling the game, so one would assume that it was in the latter half of the decade. A real shame that this one was scrapped, definitely one to try out on MAME. Another one with terrible footage but too interesting to gloss over, Psy-Phi was a fighting game being developed by a team at Sega led by the legendary Yu Suzuki. He described the concept as futuristic dodgeball, and it was to be the first ever arcade fighter to incorporate touchscreen controls. Although described as a fighting game, its gameplay sits in a grey area. Players perform attacks by tracing set patterns on the 29-inch touchscreen or by pressing symbols. The game was shown in playable form at JAMA 2005 and was slated for a 2006 release, but arcade units were recalled early that year for whatever reason and the game disappeared. I'm not sure if this is pronounced RIP Squad or RIP Squad, as I've seen the text stylized in both upper and lower case, but either way, it's a first-person driving shooting game. Apparently it was inspired by Call of Duty and a 60s TV show called Rat Patrol, which I've never heard of before, but both have military themes. It was being developed by Midway from 1999 to 2001. As we can see from this footage supplied by ArcadeHeroes.com, the cabinets were pretty interesting, having a seat that would vibrate to simulate the vehicle's movement and a mounted .50 caliber machine gun similar to the gun on Operation Wolf cabinets. In the information I could find online, it stated that the vehicle you're driving is a Jeep, but in some of the levels it's driving on water, so I'm not sure if this was just an unfinished element of the game or if it was some kind of amphibious vehicle. In 2001, Midway ceased producing arcade games to focus on home consoles, and several games still in development were abandoned, including this. Ghost Lock was developed by Data East in the mid-90s for SNK's Neo Geo MVS arcade system. Not much was known about the game until collector Billy Pitt bought a prototype cartridge in 2003. The cart was in the hands of an acquaintance who'd been given it for location testing in '96, and he managed to buy it for $3,000. After dumping the ROM, he sold it onto a French team who made a small batch of reproduction carts, and the ROM was subsequently released freely online. The game was actually meant to be called Ghost Rope, but as is common with Japanese to English translations, the letters L and R can get mixed up, resulting in Ghost Lop. It's a puzzle game similar in style to Puzzle Bobble, but you're playing as a ghost-busting baseball cap-wearing man who throws balls at ghosts that are gathering above. In principle, it's pretty much the same setup as all these games are, except the fact that your guy can move around freely at the bottom of the screen in order to gain the optimal angle. There is a 2-player mode, and in single player you take on ghosts of varying proficiency. Ghost Lot was cancelled as the location testing returned poor results, but if busting makes you feel good, you can play it in MAME. The absolutely shocking fighter Rise of the Robots was planned for the arcade, as well as the many home computers and consoles that it tainted with its existence. Originally developed by Instinct Design, who judging by this game ironically had very little instinct when it came to design, Rise of the Robots received a great deal of attention at the time, being covered in magazines and on TV. If you haven't played it, the game is awful. The moves are utterly dull, and it ends up being a battle of button bashing and cheap spamming. Of all its flaws, the character balancing is probably the worst, which is the final nail in the coffin for any small sense of satisfaction you may have had playing it. UK fruit machine manufacturer Bellfruit developed an arcade cab based on PC architecture, and Rise of the Robots was one of the games to use it. Although prototype cabs were developed and tested, they unsurprisingly didn't fare well, so it never made it past the prototype stage. It seems that the cabinets were as poor as the game itself, so it was just one big recipe for disaster. Asylum was an arcade game very similar to Gauntlet, developed in 1991 by Leland, is it Leland or Leyland, who made the awesome Super Off-Road, which is a game that I absolutely loved on Amiga, and I always make sure to play on the arcade cabinet with 3 steering wheels whenever I'm at Arcade Club. Asylum would be their own answer to Gauntlet, a maze-like adventure game supporting up to 3 players. Perhaps a contributing factor in its cancellation, this game is very bizarre. The heroes are attempting to escape an asylum in which they've been unwillingly imprisoned by the imaginatively named Mr. G. The intro screen tells you all you need to know. You'll need to collect credit cards which act as cash. The aim of each level is to make it to the lift to progress to the next floor, and you can flush out the uncoolness using magic toilets. Wait, what? That's right, it actually says that. What this means is that your health is represented by a cool meter, and you use toilets to restore your health. Why on earth they thought this was a good idea is beyond me, and the cryptic explanation describing the process as flushing out the uncoolness rather than telling you this is how you restore hit points is equally as baffling. The levels are filled with traps and enemies to overcome. Enemies come in a wide variety of types, including monsters, animals, robots, and the asylum's human guards. Many of the traps are pretty cheap and will catch you unawares, killing you instantly. The lift that takes you up to the next level represents a challenge in itself, as the cable frays and breaks, sending you plummeting down a dynamite-laden shaft. You'll need to steer the lift from side to side in order to avoid the explosives, then hit a padded area at the bottom which sees you hilariously bounce back up the shaft. Then, somehow, the lift will magically stop at your desired floor. Ridiculous, but a nice idea in all honesty. The levels consist mostly of this top-down action-adventure gameplay, with the expected power-ups etc. being found throughout the levels, but there is another strange bit where you're going from one building to another by jumping on clouds. It's very dull and seems completely unnecessary considering it's the only platforming section in the game, and there are absolutely no consequences to falling, as if you fall the giant bat rescues you and takes you to the next level anyway without any loss of life. Considering all the strange design choices and countless cheap deaths in the game, it's no wonder that Asylum was cancelled. The Last Starfighter was a 1984 sci-fi film about a kid who, due to his skill at playing the Starfighter arcade game, is enlisted by the game's alien creator to pilot a real Starfighter spaceship in an interstellar war. Atari were planning to release a real game called The Last Starfighter after the film. It would have featured recreations of battle scenes in the film and used the same arcade controller as Atari's Star Wars. Gameplay is similar to the Star Wars arcade game in that you're aiming a reticle to shoot, but The Last Starfighter's graphics were 3D polygons rather than the vector graphics of Star Wars and many of their other successful arcade games. Atari cancelled the game when some of their executives saw the film during post-production and thought that it'd be a commercial flop. I swear, Atari cancelled more arcade games than everyone else put together, as this is yet another of theirs, Beavis and Butthead. Based on Mike Judge's characters from the NTV show of the same name, this was a side-scrolling beat-em-up reminiscent of Konami's Simpsons arcade game, planned for a 1996 release. It was never finished, and Atari abandoned the project after it tested poorly, but 12 cabs were made and sold at auction by MTV in 1999. It's thought that MTV kept one cab, but the only known working machine is at Galloping Ghost Arcade near Chicago, who kindly supplied this footage of that very same cabinet. The game was built on 3DO hardware, so parts from a 3DO had to be salvaged in order to restore the arcade game to working order. It's presented very well, I think, with the graphics being a solid representation of Mike Judge's source material. The scrolling is more three-dimensional than traditional beat-em-ups, which seems to flow well. If you're ever in the Chicago area, be sure to give Galloping Ghost a visit, as they have several prototype machines available to play, so there's plenty there to entertain us.
He said anus.
Entertain us, anus. Oh, yeah.
F.R.E.A.K.S is a 3D fighter from Midway, released on PlayStation, N64 and Windows in 1998. It was originally planned to appear at arcades too, but it didn't make it past the prototype stage. Considering it was the late 90s, it's likely that Midway weren't too confident about going up against the arcade fighter big boys at the time, like Tekken 3, so they aborted the plan to release it in arcades. If you're a fan of the game, at least there were some home versions released that you can play, but if you're particularly curious about the arcade version, the prototype can be played on MAME, or again, Galloping Ghost have a playable version. The Act could be one of the best looking arcade games of all time, and for good reason. The artwork was hand drawn by former Disney animators. It was developed in 2007 by US studio Secropia and was tested in several locations. It fared reasonably well and received a good enough reception from critics, but they couldn't find a publisher willing to take it on. As you can see from this Arcade Heroes footage of the arcade version at the Game Grid Arcade in Utah, the game looks gorgeous, and the cabinets were presented like a modern quiz machine and look pretty slick. The Act was cancelled in 2007, and the following year the studio shut down. 40 kits were sold off in total, which were essentially just PCs fitted with a custom jammer to PC board. 10 were sold on eBay, 2 of the dedicated cabs that were used for the location tests were also sold, and the remaining kits were given to employees. It was later ported to iOS and OS X by another company and looks just as good, if not better, than it did at the arcade. In the Act, you take on the role of hospital window cleaner Edgar, who falls in love with one of the nurses when he spots her through a window. This kicks off a wacky caper involving several characters, and of course, all manner of hilarity ensues. The game plays like you would expect from an interactive movie, with each scene having a specific goal. If you know what you're doing, it's a very short game, so it's like watching an animated Disney short, really. A shame it was cancelled, but at least it was released in some form, and if you're a fan of the classic Disney animation style, then this is definitely one to check out. R-Gear was to be a sequel to Ray-Force, the popular vertical shooter from Taito. You may know Ray-Force by another name, as its Saturn port was renamed to Layer Section in Japan and Galactic Attack in the West. Very little's known about this would-be sequel, as the only footage available is this demo, which appears on Taito's Ray Ray Collection CD. What we do know is that it would have had 2 selectable ships, and that only 2 stages were completed before it was canned. It seems that many of the game's assets were rehashes of Ray Forces, although the stages are completely new. Argear was ultimately abandoned in favour of Ray Storm, another sequel to Ray Force, also known as Layer Section 2. It's always heartbreaking for me making these videos, and I'm sure it's equally saddening for you guys watching because we see so much hard work go to waste. Recalhorn is a perfect example, as it just seems like countless hours of hard work has gone into this. I've no idea how they came up with the name, but Recalhorn stars a kid with a magic flute making his way through a fantastical land, presumably on some kind of quest, although God knows what, because neither the intro nor the ending give anything away. It's a platform game that's pretty generic at face value. The kid, whatever his name might be, can attack the many hostile creatures in levels by using his magic flute or by jumping on their heads. It soon gets more interesting when you start riding on the backs of animals. There are 3 animals to ride in all, a monkey, a seal and a lion. Each has its own special abilities. This not only opens up the ways in which you can approach the levels, but also kind of renders the magic flute redundant. The levels are split into 4 worlds, and there's some really nice variety. Location wise, all the usual suspects are represented: forest, mountain, caves, underwater, and there are some more unique levels in the mix too, like a pirate ship and a clock tower. A significant portion of the game occurs underwater actually, so the seal is often a very useful companion. All in all, it's a very enjoyable and well presented platform game, but one that was perhaps better suited to a home console. Rumour has it that, as with many games on this list, Recalhorn didn't test well, so it was cancelled, perhaps for that very reason, but it's a shame that they couldn't translate the arcade version into a home console port of some kind. Yet another Atari Games fighter here. Vicious Circle was developed in 1996 and was their answer to Killer Instinct. The game had 9 available characters from which to choose, but I'm not aware of any story to the game as details are thin on the ground. In fact, very little was known about the game beyond an early 96 prototype which was shown at California Extreme shows until it was subsequently dumped and made playable in Maine. Some of the backgrounds are static and some are animated, but to be honest these made me feel a bit queasy as the movement behind while I was focusing on the foreground brought on a bit of motion sickness. This ran on the Kojak arcade hardware, which is a more powerful version of the Atari Jaguar's technology. The Kojak hardware had very few planned games and most of them were cancelled, including of course Vicious Circle. I was never a fan of Killer Instinct anyway, so no real loss for me here, but I'm sure many of you watching are. Slipstream was a 1995 Capcom arcade racer based on Formula 1, although it wasn't officially licensed. It ran on Sega's System 32 arcade hardware and it technically was released, as 150 boards were made and it was released in Brazil. I'm not sure if this happened after the planned mainstream release was cancelled or not, but it's unlikely that Capcom would have developed an arcade game in '95 specifically for the Brazilian market. Slipstream had a lot of meat for a 2D arcade racer, featuring 3 game modes, 4 tracks based on real-world Grand Prix courses, and 8 cars with varying capabilities. Graphically, it really appeals to me, having vibrant colours and a gorgeous 2D art style indicative of a 90s Capcom arcade game. The gameplay is really fast and certainly went for the arcadey feel over realism. The name Slipstream comes from the car's ability to get into an opponent's slipstream and charge up a boost meter, adding something a little different to the usual setup of this kind of racer. Sadly, what was one of Slipstream's strongest assets in my opinion, its graphics, probably caused its demise. By '95 most arcade racers had moved on to a more realistic presentation and most were 3D, whereas this is more akin to those of the early 90s like Outrun and Power Drift. The Eye of Typhoon was a planned sequel to the 1994 Neo Geo MVS game Fight Fever. Just like its predecessor, this was a 2D fighter developed by Vicom in '96 and was shown at Japanese Arcade Expo that year as an MVS game, but it never emerged. There are 12 fighters available plus 2 bosses with some decent character design. It's a traditional 2D fighter setup, but there's also a 2-on-2 mode as well. After the arcade version was cancelled, the Eye of Typhoon was released on the 3DO and on DOS, but only in South Korea. In fact, it's the DOS version that you're seeing here, and it looks fantastic considering this is a DOS game, despite it being the weaker of the two versions. Admittedly, 1996 was late for a DOS release, but still, it's pretty stunning. I'm not sure why it was cancelled or how many prototypes exist, but in MVS circles it's considered to be very rare. So those were 20 more unreleased arcade games. I hope there was something in there to appeal to everyone, so let me know which of them you think would have made a great game had they been officially released. Thanks again for all the suggestions in the comments of the previous episode, and thank you to Arcade Heroes and the Galloping Ghost Arcade for the exclusive footage. I'll see you on the next episode of Cancelled Games, and as always, thanks for watching. You can find the previous episodes in my Cancelled Games series in this playlist.